Dr. Lipkin, wonderful to have you here on at the India Today Conclave 2021. Uh, I trust you're well because I know that you had COVID also a few months ago. Are you much better now? Completely all well with you?
Yes, I'm much improved. I'm sad that I can't be with you in person. I've been to this conclave before. It is a fantastic opportunity to exchange ideas.
From the time you were last here at a conclave to the time you're now here, the world has changed. And I want to start by asking you, Dr. Lipkin, in 2010, your film that you predicted this scenario of uncannily similar to COVID-19, what was it? Did you gaze into the future, or do you believe what we've gone through in the last 18 months was somehow inevitable, was going to happen sooner rather than later?
I would like to think that it was not inevitable, but sadly, as you've said, it did come to pass, and it was something that we predicted long ago. If you go back to the 1918 influenza pandemic, there were many lessons there that we've not carried forward into the current time, and I hope we will revise our approach in the future, but I'm not even confident that this is the worst of the potential pandemics. So we need to make sure that whatever we've learned here carries forward into the next months and years. So this has been devastating in ethical terms and loss of life, economically, political instability, and we must learn from these mistakes.
I'll come to the lessons, Dr. Lipkin, in a moment, but let's just look at the hard numbers. 4.5 million deaths and counting, 210 million cases globally. Has this been far worse than you imagined, or do you believe actually, given the fact that we've now got a vaccine much faster than ever in the past, we've managed relatively well?
I think the numbers, as we will eventually find them to be, are going to be much worse than what you've just cited. Many of us believe that there's an undercounting and that it may be as much as tenfold. Then, of course, you have the economic fallout, which has been staggering. The estimates from The Economist are that by 2025, we will have lost 22 trillion US dollars in GDP. India alone has probably lost close to $1 trillion in GDP. This has been a staggering burden on the whole world in human terms, economic terms, and so on.
Can I ask you, Dr.
Is the worst behind us? I think it probably is. But saying that, I have to acknowledge that this virus has surprised us continuously since it first emerged.
So is the worst over? It's a question I'm sure that you're being asked increasingly. Can we confidently say that the worst of the pandemic is over?
I hope so. I can't say so with a great deal of confidence. It really depends on how we continue to respond. There has been a problem with leadership globally in addressing this. There have been people who have misspoken, who have led us to false panaceas. Drugs that don't work are potentially toxic. We have not shared vaccines as widely as we should. And the best route out of this is, in fact, vaccination. And I will say this, India is has the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. The Serum Institute of Pune is poised to lead here. And I think this is something that India should be proud of and should acknowledge and should promote.
But Dr. Lipkin, when you say that you're not sure whether the worst is over, what is it that you now fear? Could there be, 2021 was seen to be the year of the variants. 2020 was the year of the virus. 2021, we've had variants. We have 4 at the moment, alpha, beta, delta, which troubles large parts of the world, and gamma. Do you see more variants? Is that the fear? Do you believe that we should all continue, therefore, to mask up and be very careful when we go out?
So you've asked several questions. Let me take them one at a time. The first is, will we see more variants? Yes, There are variants already circulating that don't have names. Will they be more capable of transmission? We don't know. Delta seems to be extraordinarily well adapted to spread in humans. It is somewhere between 100 and 1,000-fold more likely to spread than some of the earliest variants that we saw. But there's another form of COVID that people don't talk about yet, which I think is going to be extraordinary in terms of its impact. And that is what we refer to as long COVID. There are a number of other ways to describe it. So these are not people who necessarily have severe acute disease. They may have only mild disease, but they remain permanently, or at least for a long period of time, crippled with cognitive dysfunction, shortness of breath, fatigue. This can represent as many as 30% of people who become infected. And these individuals, even if the virus were to magically disappear, might continue to be infected and have a huge impact on their lives and on culture for decades to come. So it's a very complicated picture. We have to think about the acute disease and the importance of preventing future pandemics. We also need to think about what it is we're going to do for these people who've experienced COVID and who are likely to be ill for several months or years to come.
Is the solution, though, purely vaccination, or is it a new form of social behavior, where even at gatherings like here at the India Today Conclave, we'll have to be conscious of social distancing, of masking, of generally maintaining high levels of hygiene? Is that now going to be the new normal?
So in the East, for many, for generations, you've had a very different approach to greeting one another. Like so, as opposed to shaking hands and transferring things like antibiotic-resistant bacteria, viruses, and so forth. Since 1918, when you go to China or you go to Japan, when people are ill, they wear masks on public conveyances and in public in general. The West has not done that. This has led to the spread not only of this coronavirus, but in earlier times, other viruses associated with respiratory disease, the most infectious of agents that we have. So at present, I think there's a triad, if you will, of things that we need to do in the future. The vaccination, as I say, is first and foremost. And when I talk about vaccines, let me also tell you that the types of vaccines that we're making now that are given by injection are more difficult to administer than oral vaccines or nasal vaccines. In addition, although they may prevent serious systemic disease, the virus going deep in the lungs, the heart, or other locations, if you have a way to prevent the virus from getting access to the body in the first place through what we call mucosal immunity, you may actually be able to prevent infection and reduce transmission in the entire population. If you look at all the viruses now the old vaccines being studied for SARS-CoV-2 by the World Health Organization, for example, 10% of them are mucosal vaccines. So I think this is another area where we need to shift. We need to think not only about virus vaccines that prevent severe disease, but also that prevent transmission. The second thing is that we need to improve our public health infrastructure. We have to be able to track and trace individuals who've been exposed so that we can adopt what we call like a ring vaccination strategy, which was what was so successful in India, right, in eradicating smallpox. So there are people who are now beginning to explore those kinds of issues. Masking, even if these masks are not what I would consider state-of-the-art masks, can also be useful. But people need to change the way they think about themselves and others and be less selfish. Think about protecting the person next to you. This is not something, particularly in the West, that we have done very well.
What about a booster dose? Do you see a booster dose as being almost inevitable? Will we have to take a dose almost every year for the next few years?
I think the answer to that one is not entirely clear, but right now it is clear that for protection, for example, versus Delta, And we should talk about the different vaccines because they all have different performance profiles. The RNA-based vaccines, thus far, if you've had 2 doses, whether it's Moderna or the Pfizer BioNTech, these seem to give you very, very good protection for several months. After 6 to 8 months, particularly in people who are older or whoever have other sorts of complicating conditions, that immunity begins to wane and they need a 3rd dose. We want, again, not only to protect against severe disease, but any disease at all, because even mild disease can result in the syndrome of long COVID that can be quite disabling. So I will tell you that I've had a 3rd dose of one of the RNA vaccines, and we're in the process right now of trying to figure out what the strategy is that we should use for the other vaccines that people are using. Now, like, for example, Covishield, which is produced at the Serum Institute in Pune, you're probably going to need a 3rd dose of that. That's the AstraZeneca-based vaccine. There's a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. You will need other ones of those as well. Now, the Sinopharm Sinovac vaccines, which are used worldwide, appear to be less effective than some of these other vaccines. So I think there you may want to shift, because they were based on killed virus. So there are many different ways. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm simply saying people seem to think that vaccines are all the same, and they're really not. They're vaccines that are based on the genetic material that you inject directly into cells. That then results in expression of a protein that elicits an immune response, which is protective. Then there are virus delivery systems. There's killed virus. All of these things vary. But again, the thing that I really wish to emphasize is that we should be thinking more about these mucosal vaccines, because they protect not only the person who gets the vaccine, but everyone around them.
You know, Dr. Lipkin, the United States still showing about 2,000 deaths a day, clearly suggesting that we are still way away from finally conquering coronavirus. Is there something specific that's gone wrong in the United States, or do you believe the world also needs to be on guard? Who knows when next the variant comes? It could be contagious, and therefore what happens in the US today could happen somewhere else tomorrow.
We have a different problem in the US than those countries that would take vaccines, largely if they had access to them. We are awash in vaccines. That is not our problem. Our problem has been disinformation through various social media platforms and politicians and others who have equated taking a vaccine with being weak or being somehow on the wrong side of a political issue. That has nothing to do with politics. So, for example, when our last president, Donald Trump, left the White House, he was vaccinated prior to leaving. He should have done that on national television. He didn't do so. There are examples where leaders worldwide could have stepped up and said, this is critical, we must do this, we must protect ourselves and one another. Leadership has been lacking globally. This is not unique to the United States. There are many places that I could cite where you have similar problems. And our hope now is that we are going to depoliticize this, because the sooner we get everyone vaccinated, the sooner we're going to get out of this morass. And the director of the WHO, has talked about this, and he's right. There's no question. But the WHO, as you probably know, has the ability to, make suggestions, make recommendations, but they don't have any real power to mandate anything. That is done at the level of nations and states.
Give us the roadmap for the next 12 to 24 months. If you were, that's the short term really. How do you see the world, let's say 12 months from now, Dr. Lipkin? Will we be in a much better place?
I think that 12 months from now, we will be in a much better place, because I am an optimist and I believe that everybody's going to step up and support the WHO and Gavi and get as many people vaccinated as possible. We need to vaccinate probably 90% of the world's population. Now, How do we get there? This is going to be a question of the wealthier countries saying this is in our own best interest, as well as being the only ethical approach to getting out of this particular problem that we have right now. During the interim, there are things that we can all do. We still need to physically distance. We still need to mask whenever we go into certain kinds of situations. So at Columbia University, although everyone is vaccinated, we still mask indoors. And this is something that we will do until we feel it's safe.
So when is that moment when you will feel safe? I think the world needs to know, what is that moment where I can go out and live my life as it was pre-COVID? Is there a magic moment?
I think we are approaching a magic moment in the following ways. We began to see now that there are drugs which, if you become infected, can be very useful in preventing progression of disease. If we have a drug that can be used to prevent severe disease, if we have 90% of the population vaccinated, if we have the availability of tests that can rapidly tell you who is infected and who is infectious so that we can make decisions about isolating individuals, masking individuals, putting them onto drugs which prevent progression of disease, I think we will be in a position where we can move back to life toward normal. We nonetheless, and this is something that I must emphasize, have to consider the possibility that there are going to be other infectious agents, other respiratory viruses, typically RNA viruses that can evolve and mutate, that will be coming along, just as we said when we developed the screenplay back in 2008. This is not the last enemy that humankind will confront. We need to pursue surveillance. We need to ensure that every nation has the ability to diagnose disease in its borders and to respond and to be transparent in sharing that information.
So what do you see next? Since you mentioned your screenplay, which you began in 2008, talking about the possibility of a pandemic of the kind we witnessed, what comes next, Dr. Lipkin?
The thing that I'm most concerned about still is a new influenza virus. Influenza viruses are continuously evolving. We are monitoring them, but it's possible that a new influenza virus could emerge that could challenge us yet again. And if you think in terms of the numbers of people who've probably died now, which is probably, as I say, closer to 50 million than to 5 million, this means that we're still well below what we saw in 1918 with influenza, where we had something like 100 million people who died with a much smaller global population. So I'm still worried about flu. And there are other things. Look at what HIV has done to us, right? Antimicrobial resistance. All of these things should be on our radar screen. The other thing that I continually try to emphasize is that preventing this is cheap. It truly is. So if you look at what it's cost India, what it's cost the world in terms of people and dollars and so forth, a surveillance system such as the ones that we propose represents 0.001% of that economic burden. So it's really cheap to do this. And we must do this. And I will tell you that when I first went to India, which was in 1995, and fell in love with your country, I've been preaching this nonstop. And at the last conclave, which preceded this, we must do this. We must do this together.
Wants greater surveillance. Therefore, let me ask you in conclusion, from your vantage point there in New York, as you look at the numbers in India, do you believe that the time has come, open up our schools, open up society, or would you say be very, very cautious over the next few months?
The percentage of your population that is vaccinated is very small. You know, we are, you know, what is it? It's less than 20% of your population that's vaccinated.
15 to 20% double vaccinated.
Right, exactly. And then you have, what is it, 30% of your population is under the age of 18. So they're not eligible yet for vaccination. So this means that you don't have the sort of armor that you need to safely reopen in that way. I mean, I realize that this is a politically very sensitive topic, very difficult to accept. We have the same problem here in the United States, where we have states, particularly in the South, where the vaccination rates are very low and the COVID rates are extremely high. And I will remind you, because nobody talks about this very much, the chronic burden that we see in some of these patients who've had infections, who may not even have known about these infections, is extraordinary. People who can't get out of bed, can't go to work, can't maintain their activities of daily living. This is very, very difficult.
In final word, glass half full or glass half empty? After what's been a very difficult 18 months, you have a smile on your face as I ask that question. Do you believe that we should look give us the big positive as we end. We want to end, this is all about getting into the new normal, this conclave. So what's the positive takeaway?
I think we're 3/4 full. I think we're better than halfway. But as I've said before, I am an optimist. I believe in the goodness of people, and I particularly believe in the goodness of the Indian people. And I hope that some of your audience will write to me and want to partner with us in this new program called GAP, the Global Alliance for Preventing Pandemics. And you will help us mind the gap and ensure that we never have anything like this again.
Well, that's a hope on which we can look positively with a smile to the future. Dr. Lipkin, you've gone through a personally tough time, having got COVID yourself, but it's good to see you smiling, and it's good to always have your wisdom here. Thank you so much for sharing it, Dr. Lipkin. Stay well, stay safe, and it's namaskar. In future, we will always do namaskar. Thank you very much.
Namaskar.
Thank you. Dr. Ian Lipkin, one of the world's leading virologists, suggesting perhaps that things could just be slowly getting better. But we can't be complacent. Thanks very much for joining me.